Chapter 8, Sections 1 and 2 explores Washington's first steps when he comes into office and the birth of our political parties. But now we're going to move on to Chapter 8, Section 3, which examines the troubles at home and abroad. We had many foreign problems as well as domestic problems inside our own country that we had to deal with, and so we're going to take a closer look at those right now. The first of which was domestically. We had some issues with the Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley. They were disputing territories in what was now known as the Northwest Territory. So George Washington orders that territory's governor to go in and handle the issue. He goes in and he is defeated soundly, one of the worst losses in American military history. So Washington then has to send in reinforcements. He calls on a trusted man from the American Revolution, General Wayne, last name Wayne. He goes in and he is much more prepared and scores a major victory over the Native Americans of the Miami Nation, led by Chief Blue Jacket. And this would lead to the Treaty of Greenville, which basically gives us the majority of the land that is now the state of Ohio. The settlers would flock to this area in high numbers, so much so that in 1803 this region becomes the state of Ohio. So that is one issue that we were dealing with and had to contend with. The next, in 1789, the French Revolution breaks out. The Bastille is stormed, and the French people topple the French monarchy. Unlike the American Revolution, however, it is very violent, and that causes deep political divisions within our country. In the beginning of the French Revolution, most Americans supported the French in their right to overthrow their government. We felt like they were doing the same thing we were. We were supporting them because they supported us in our struggle for liberty. France had been an important ally of ours during the American Revolution, so much so that we may not have won that victory had it not been for support from France and one of their leaders, the Marquis de Lafayette. Unfortunately, though, the French got extreme, and they violently took to the king and queen, beheaded them with the guillotine, and that violence was something that of a turning point for the American support. That violence, again, like we said, divided the Americans. Thomas Jefferson, however, the Secretary of State, continued his unwavering support for the French. He felt that the French had the right to use whatever means necessary to win their freedom, just like we did. They just chose to go a more extreme route. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, however, strongly disagreed. Their belief was that any group of people that used violence to, whether it be to in a noble cause that they thought of overthrowing the government to establish democracy, could not stand, because the basic human right of respecting individual rights is a prime principle of democracy. And if they don't respect the king and queen's rights and they just cut their heads off, they're not willing to really stand for what democracy is all about. France also decided they were going to declare war on other European monarchies, and so they go a little bit overboard, and so the Americans begin to kind of back away from their support. George Washington had to decide what type of foreign policy he was going to use in this scenario. So he's weighing all that. The Americans had signed a treaty with the French after the Revolution, so we were allies technically, and France wanted to use American ports to gain supplies and to launch attacks on British ships that were still trading with America in those ports. And so Washington's got a very difficult decision to make. He sees that 75% of our trade, 90% of our imports are coming from Britain, and the majority of our federal income is coming from tariffs that we are making off British trade. And so siding against Great Britain would essentially bankrupt the United States, not a good move for a nation trying to repay all of its debt. So Washington decides that he has these two friends, Britain and France, that are arguing. He's going to step out of the picture. He can't do what France needs, so he takes the side of neutrality. In this whole deal, Hamilton points out that the treaty that we did sign back during the American Revolution was with the French king, who was now dead. Jefferson believed that the king represented the people of France when he signed that, and so it was still valid. So you see the presidential cabinet divided over this issue. Two of Washington's closest advisors are polar opposite on this issue, as they were with the National Bank. And so Washington makes his decision. He pushes Congress to sign the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, and they do that. And they also encourage the American people to not aid anybody in this cause, either Britain or France, because that could potentially drag the country into this conflict. Jefferson sees the writing on the wall. This legislation proves to be a major loss for him. As we mentioned, he and Hamilton opposed each other on many things, particularly the National Bank, interpretation of the Constitution, and here on the matter of deciding whether we should support Britain or support France. And so Jefferson sees that Washington is not listening to his advice, and so he resigns from the president's cabinet. After his resignation, Jefferson has a large following, a lot of supporters, and those supporters begin to criticize Washington, something he is not accustomed to. And he takes it personally, and this wears on him, as you'll see. It basically forces him out of public office, this idea of being unliked by many. Britain had issued several warnings to neutral nations, so now that we are one of those neutral nations, should be subject to these warnings. Do not trade with France or any of their colonies. We had a very large merchant marine. We were trading with a lot of countries and sending ships and cargo all over the place. Britain began to seize those ships, confiscate that cargo, and impress our sailors into service for the British Navy. Not a good thing. This is clearly a violation of the rights of a neutral nation. And so this kind of provokes a lot of Americans into basically wanting to declare a second war on Great Britain. Washington knows this is not a good move. He still wants to trade with both countries. Hamilton, who wants an alliance with Great Britain desperately, pleads for Washington to give one last try to prevent war with Britain again. So he sends a very trusted ally, John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to Great Britain to negotiate a treaty. And the reasons for this, Britain had been they had captured up to 250 sailors in the West Indies. Americans were calling for war, but were too weak to fight, but the people may not see it that way. So in 1794, John Jay negotiates what is known as Jay's Treaty, and here are the terms for that treaty. He negotiates an agreement for Britain to pay for all the damages done to those seized ships. Britain agrees to leave the forts that they were holding in the western United States, and the Americans had to pay back all of their old private debts to Great Britain. Now, this is met with a lot of negativity. It was approved by the Senate, but there was no promise of ending any of the violation of our rights as a neutral nation. Didn't mention anything about freeing those impressed sailors. The U.S. seemed to concede more than Great Britain. It says Hamilton told the British of Jay's instructions, and essentially what we're trying to understand here is that Hamilton had mentioned to the British beforehand what was at stake, and the United States really had no leverage in this scenario. So we ended up coming out of the treaty looking like the loser in the agreement. And there was vast opposition to this treaty. When Jay returned home, he goes to give a speech in his native New York. His effigy is hanged and thrown. The people begin to throw stones at it while he's giving a speech, almost intimidating him to leave and never come back. And so you can see just how Jay's Treaty seemingly was a failure. All of that is going on. When Jay's Treaty is signed, Spain begins to get paranoid. They thought there was some secret deal to attack New Orleans. They were afraid that the United States and Great Britain had entered into some secret deal. They were going to attack New Orleans and Florida and take this land from them. And so they asked for a meeting. Washington sends Thomas Pinckney to Spain to negotiate this treaty. And what the U.S. gets out of this treaty is actually very, very good. They now have free navigation of the Mississippi River. Their traders and farmers have the right of deposit in the port of New Orleans, and we gain all of the land in the southern parts of what is now Mississippi, Alabama, the Florida Panhandle, that area. So anything east of the Mississippi River now completely belongs to the United States. So while Jay's Treaty was a failure as far as in terms the relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain, it actually ends up being a positive because it somewhat tricked Spain into conceding all of these things in Pinckney's treaty. So with all national security issues seemingly resolved, the Americans are once again ready to settle the West, expand, and move forward. That all comes about toward the end of Washington's second term as president, in his second term, kind of in that range. Washington had wanted to retire after his first term, but he only came back because Hamilton and Jefferson convinced him to do so. Now, those two guys are in opposition of each other. Jefferson has resigned, and Washington says, "This is not for me." He had stated multiple times that he would rather dig ditches than continue as president. He enjoyed his second term even less than his first term, so a third term was not an option, and so he decides to retire to Mount Vernon to run his estate. But looking back on his presidency in Washington, there were many things that he can be proud of. Didn't go as well as he had hoped, but he did do some good things. He had fixed many of the problems with the Articles of Confederation. Our economy was back on the right track. Our issues with the Native Americans in the Western territories have been dealt with for the most part. Europe respected us as a nation, and the U.S. had shown its military power in many ways. And so he had steered us through a very difficult time and kept the country together, kept us united, and kept us respectable on the world stage. Even on his way out, he would do something that would offer sound leadership to our nation going forward. His farewell address, it says, is our true policy to steer clear of any permanent alliances. And this, what Washington says in this quote from his farewell address, is we need to mind our own business, essentially. The more we get into political issues and signing treaties and alliances with foreign countries, the more trouble we could get into if we don't pay attention. So he says, mind your own business, stay out of European affairs. That'll wrap up Section 3. When we come back with Section 4, we'll be looking at John Adams and his presidency and the things that he would deal with.